Uh, Thank you. As the late, great Ray Smullian once began to talk, before I begin speaking, I have something to say. Perhaps this distinguished audience is wondering, as I certainly am, what I'm doing sharing a podium with such illustrious speakers in the realms of, as the Dormouse put it, everything that begins with an M. That is mathematics, metrogarbology, puzzles, Mysterianism, and magic. My talk today will include a few digressions, more like a corkscrew than a path, as Alice remarked to herself. Here's your first. Did you know that the word metrogarbology is over 500 years old and was coined by none other than Francois Rabelais? Anyway, to answer my own question, over the last few gatherings, the board has been encouraging a wider appreciation for the other facets of this fascinating polymath, pun unavoidable, known as Martin Gardner. Martin was, after all, wrote or edited over 100 books, not to mention countless articles, columns, and reviews. 2 were novels, The Flight of Peter From in 1973 and Visitors from Oz in 1988. But the rest, aside from collections of short stories, were nonfiction. He also wrote a book of original poems called Never Make Fun of a Turtle, My Son in 1969. His first published work was a magic trick for a magazine called The Sphinx in May of 1930 when he was 15, and his last was his posthumous autobiography of sorts called Undiluted Hocus Pocus in 2015, a publishing career of 85 years. But the major inspiration for my being here is, of course, the annotated Alice, with over 1 million copies, million copies in print in 4 major editions and 11 languages, which has outsold all his other books combined by, I suspect, a very large factor. For the record, the languages are English, Chinese, Spanish, Japanese, Korean, Italian, Portuguese, Dutch, Russian, German, and Hebrew. Part of this is no doubt due to the global viral phenomenon that is the Alice duad. For those of you who were at my talk last night, I don't need to defend that statement. The Alice books are the most quoted, the most widely illustrated, and 2 of the most translated novels in existence. For those of you who are here at the 11th and 13th gatherings, or last night, I promised to try to minimize repeating myself. At the 11th, my talk was called Martin and Lewis. Martin and Lewis. Okay. Oh yes, and my talk at the last gathering was tied into the first gathering was tied into a book I did called A Bouquet for the Gardener, Martin Gardner Remembered. And then the last gathering, Jim Gardner and I spoke about the 150th anniversary deluxe edition of the annotated Alice, which had just come out under my editorship and art direction. But back again to Martin and Lewis. When Gardner was asked about his fascination with Alice in Wonderland, he replied, "I share with Carroll the following loves: mathematics, puzzles, formal logic, and conjuring. Carroll delighted in showing simple magic tricks to his child friends and to take them to performances by magicians. More than any other book for children, his 2 Alice books swarm with logical, mathematical, and linguistic jokes. I did not discover the richness of this kind of humor in the Alice books until I was in my 20s, but since then I have felt a close kinship with Carroll." A brilliant ambigram by Scott Kim, of course, when turned upside down, reveals an even closer tie between them. The world knows Carroll, of course, as the author of the 2 Alice books and the nonsense poem, The Hunting of the Snark. He also was a polymath, to say the least. The Reverend Dodson was by profession a mathematics teacher at Oxford and the author of over 60 books or pamphlets on mathematics and logic. One of the directives of our Lewis Carroll Society of North America 35 years ago was to publish every one of Carroll's or Dodson's pamphlets, which was completed last year with volume 6. Volumes 2, Mathematics, and volumes 4, Logic, could be of interest to attendees here, and I would particularly recommend volume 5, edited by Chris Morgan, Games, Puzzles, and Related Pieces. Carroll was a ceaseless inventor of puzzles involving recreational math and wordplay, along with various devices such as the stamp case, deviser of a system for recording and accessing his 98,000 plus letters that is called by some the first database, a master of the medium known as photography in its earliest days, a contributor to the field of cryptography, and arguably the first person to go computer shopping when he stopped by the house of Charles Babbage in January of 1867 to inquire if such a thing as an analytical engine could be had. It was over a century before personal computers were sold, so he was a bit early. By the way, this picture is from a fantastic graphic novel I highly recommend. So what does this literary Englishman have to do with a scientific American? Let us begin, as the King of Hearts suggests, at the beginning. Scientific American started publication in 1845 as a weekly newspaper, promising that it will contain general notices of the progress of mechanical and other scientific improvements, useful information and instruction in various arts and trades, curious philosophical experiments, miscellaneous intelligence, music, and poetry. Going on to describe itself as a family newspaper, it will convey more useful intelligence to children and young people than 5 times its cost in school instruction. Even then, it wasn't strictly about the sciences of mechanics, chemistry, and architecture, but was also concerned with, quote, engaging the minds of everyone, even youngsters. So, Charlie Dodson, that's Carroll's real name, was 13 when the magazine debuted, and certainly could have come across an issue or two in the next 53 years of his life, but there's no record of it actually having occurred. Conversely, the name Lewis Carroll may have appeared in its August pages before 1956, perhaps as one of those curious philosophical experiments. But I wish to start with the article Lewis Carroll, Mathematician by Warren Weaver in the April 1956 issue, and then concentrate mainly on the 14 columns in Gardner's Mathematical Games, wherein Carroll's name is mentioned 105 times. The first being called Memorizing Numbers, published in October 1957, and one of the last being Fun with Eggs, Part 1, in April 1980, where he is mentioned en passant in relation to Humpty Dumpty. Here's another digression for you. Did you know it was Lewis Carroll who was responsible for popularizing the notion of Humpty Dumpty as an anthropomorphic egg? In the original nursery rhyme, dating back to the 17th century, he was a siege engine, or cannon, from the English Civil War, whose support tower had collapsed, which explains not only the booming sound of his name, but why the king's horses and men were so involved. Dana Richards, as many of you know, is preparing an authorized biography of Martin Gardner. As part of his bibliography, he had made a name index of the individuals appearing in Gardner's column, and it turns out that, yes, Lewis Carroll, this literary Englishman, is the most referenced individual in Gardner's columns, despite competition from the usual suspects like Conway, Penrose, Coxeter, Dudney, Lloyd, and so on. Before Gardner's articles began, as I mentioned, Warren Weaver's article, Lewis Carroll, Mathematician, appeared in the April 1856 issue. Weaver was an American mathematician who lived from 1894 to 1978. He was director of the Division of Natural Sciences at the Rockefeller Foundation, president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. His major interest was the machine translation of human languages, about which he corresponded with Claude Shannon and Norbert Wiener. His interest in this led to his fascination with translations of Alice in Wonderland, about which he wrote a book, Alice in Many Tongues, published in 1964. It discussed the art of the translator with examples in the 42 languages into which it had been translated at the time. That number has expanded greatly in the half century since then, with our publication, Alice in a World of Wonderlands, published in 2015, detailing, and listing editions in 174 languages and dialects. The count, by the way, is currently at 190. But it's Carroll's mathematics and logic that Weaver addressed in the article. It begins, Lewis Carroll was so great a literary genius that we are naturally curious to know the caliber of his work in mathematics. There's a common tendency to consider mathematics so strange, subtle, rigorous, difficult, and deep a subject that if a person is a mathematician, he is, of course, a great mathematician, there being, so to speak, no small giants. This is very complimentary, but unfortunately not necessarily true. Carroll produced a considerable volume of writing on many mathematical subjects from which we may judge the quality of his contributions. What sort of mathematician, in fact, was he? Weaver comes to the reluctant conclusion that Dodson was a mediocre mathematician. But in the 64 years since then, Dodson's abilities and talents in that area have been reevaluated in a much more positive direction, resulting in many articles and, to date, several substantive volumes. But this is outside our universe of discourse, and the good news is that 2 of my Carrollian colleagues who are far more qualified than I to speak on this topic, Stan Isaacs and Stuart Moskowitz, will follow me with back-to-back talks on that very topic. Weaver did mention specifically a few of Carroll's favorite puzzles, such as the monkey and the weights. And I suppose if Lloyd is missing one of his L's, so is Mr. Carroll. So Gardner's columns have been collected, of course, into books over the years, as I'm sure you're aware, and onto a CD in 2005. Somewhat ironically, Martin was not a fan of computers, except that he found one use for them, that is, searching through his old columns, indispensable. Martin's first mathematical games column appeared in the December 1956 issue. It was titled Hexaflexagons. Almost 300 more columns were to follow. The first mention of Carroll was in a column called Memorizing Numbers, published in the October 1957 issue. It discusses Pierre Arrigon's idea in 1634 for a number alphabet to facilitate memorizing numbers by substituting consonants for digits, then adding vowels to form words. Carroll's 1877 cyclist-style leaf, Memoria Technica, was an improvement over Richard Gray's 1730 version of the same idea. Using it, Carroll records that he applied his system to memorize pi to 71 decimals and the logarithms of all prime numbers under 100. On the other hand, Carroll's nephew and first biographer, Stuart Dodson Collingwood, said his uncle was terrible at remembering dates and faces. Recreational Logic in the February 1959 issue mentions that Carroll was fond of inventing quaint and enormously complicated problems of what are called the Smith-Jones-Robinson variety, whose solutions require a truth table. Gardner notes one monstrous Carrollian problem involving 13 variables and 12 premises, from which one is to deduce that no magistrates are snuff takers, from his book Symbolic Logic, was fed to an IBM 704 computer and took 4 minutes to solve. Carroll, of course, solved it with pencil and paper. Some of his logic problems involve up to 50 premises. All of them are actually quite fun to read because he was using his Carrollian whimsy in coming up with examples. July 1959's column was entitled Origami and mentions Carroll's delight in that art. I doubt his foldings would look impressive. Why do I have tangrams there? I don't know. I'll speak to my, anyway, sorry. I doubt that his foldings would look impressive next to those of the domains, père et fils, but so be it. March 1960, the games and puzzles of Lewis Carroll. The date is significant. That's when he was at work at the first iteration of the annotated Alice. Many of the subjects of this article I'll talk about later, so I have treated them here with a little superficiality. Otherwise, this one article would comprise most of my talk. Gardner opens his column by echoing Weaver's conclusion. The Reverend Charles L. Dodson, who wrote Immortal Fantasy under the pseudonym of Lewis Carroll, was an undistinguished mathematician who delivered dull lectures at Oxford and penned equally dull treatises on such topics as geometry and algebraic determinants. Only when he approached mathematics in a less serious mood does his subject and way of writing about it take on lasting interest. He mentions the easy availability, thanks to Dover, of Carroll's 2 volumes of original puzzles, A Tangled Tale, and Pillow Problems, or his Symbolic Logic, or The Game of Logic, and says he wouldn't touch any topics in either of those or overlap any material in Weaver's earlier article. Here I must introduce Mein Herr, from Sylvian Bruno Concluded, Carroll's failed and, it must be admitted, occasionally nauseating attempt at a social romance novel incorporating elements of fairy tale, regrettably spoken by a young male fairy in baby talk. The professorial Mein Herr speaks in a German accent, but we're not even sure if he's from this planet. Anyway, he instructs one of the protagonists, Lady Muriel, how to sew up what he calls Fortunatus's purse from a handkerchief first folded into a Mobius strip, its edges joined. Here's an attempt at this from an impossible object by Susan Goldstein from a previous gathering. The column also goes into a map we'll talk about later, a problem of finding 3 rational-sided right-angled triangles equal in area, and a logical problem involving liars and truth-tellers, and quotes from Carroll's Dynamics of a Particle. Plain superficiality is a character of a speech in which any 2 points being taken, the speaker is found to lie, wholly with regard to those 2 points. Plain anger is the inclination of 2 voters to one another who meet together but whose views are not in the same direction. When a proctor meeting another proctor makes the votes on one side equal to those on the other, the feeling entertained by each side is called right anger. When 2 parties coming together feel a right anger, each is said to be complementary to the other, though strictly speaking, this is very seldom the case. Obtuse anger is that which is greater than right anger. He goes on to discuss Finnegan's Wake and Vladimir Nabokov, which I'll talk about in a moment, but the bulk of this article was about Carroll's invention of what he called word links, later changed to doublets, which he invented at Christmas 1877 for 2 girls who had nothing to do. Doublets, also called word ladders, are puzzles that begin with 2 words, and to solve them, one must first find a chain of other words to link to the 2, in which the 2 adjacent words differ by 1 letter. This is the first one published by Carroll in Vanity Fair. His solution from grass to green is at right, and it was improved in shorter versions by several of Gardner's readers below. If you're interested in such things, I again recommend Chris's volume 5 of the pamphlets book. Here's another digression, Vladimir's private joke with Martin. In the original 1964 edition of The Ambidextrous Universe, Gardner quoted 2 lines of poetry from Nabokov's 1962 novel Pale Fire that are supposed to have been written by a poet, John Shade, who is actually fictional. As a joke, Gardner credited the lines to Shade rather than to Nabokov and put Shade's name in the index as if he were a real person. In his 1969 novel Ada, or Ardor, A Family Chronicle, Nabokov returned the favor, calling Martin an invented philosopher. In June of 1963, the Helix mentions Carroll in the context of symmetry, chirality, and left-handed corkscrews. Digression 4, corkscrews are mentioned several times in Through the Looking Glass. Humpty Dumpty tells Alice that the toes in Jabberwocky look something like corkscrews. He recites a poem in which he speaks of using a corkscrew to wake up the fish. And in chapter 9, the White Queen recalls his coming to her door, corkscrew in hand, looking for a hippopotamus. In August of 1963, combinatorial theory, Gardner mentions voting paradoxes. For example, assume that one person's preference for 3 candidates is in the order A, B, C, the second person prefers B, C, A, and the third prefers C, A, B. It is easy to see that a majority of the 3 voters prefer A to B, a majority prefers B to C, and confusingly, a majority also prefers C to A. Who should win? This simple paradox was first discussed in 1785 by a French mathematician, the Marquis de Condorcet, and was rediscovered by Lewis Carroll, who published many remarkable pamphlets on voting procedures. This one was from an 1876 pamphlet called A Method of Taking Votes on More Than 2 Issues, and it's become known as Dodson's method. If it were to be adapted by political parties for primaries or the government of the United States for the Electoral College, things might be a little different. But I digress. Dodson was so involved in fairness in elections, rationality in sports rankings, and proportional representation that his writings on the subject fill an entire volume of our series, Volume 3, the Political Pamphlets. September 1963, bouncing balls in polygons and polyhedrons. Gardner mentions Carroll's fondness for billiards, particularly on a circular table he had someone make for him. He produced a 2-page leaflet in 1890 that explains his rules for the game, also in our Volume 5. Gardner then discusses Carroll's cube and ball problem, which Warren Weaver discovered among Carroll's unpublished notes. It involves finding cyclic paths along which a ball can bounce forever inside a cube, always tracing the same path and hitting each side only once each cycle. The solution was not discovered until 1958 and has since been generalized to hypercubes of higher dimensions. Probably talked about somewhere along here at one of these conferences. In April 1964, Graph Theory, Carroll's first biography, the one by his nephew published in 1898, tells us that he was fond of asking little girls to draw with one unbroken line that never intersects itself the 3 squares shown here, an example of what's known as an Euler graph. September 1964 Wordplay mentions the many references in Joyce's Finnegan's Wake to Lewis Carroll, such as one of the most memorable loose corollaries ever Ellis through his cooking class. That line was in a section explaining a geometry problem. Martin himself appears in the very same section, though he was too modest to mention it. The footnote on the word whole, not a bad choice for a Wonderland scholar, reads, "I have heard this word used by Martin Halpin, an old gardener from the glens of Antrim, who used to do odd jobs for my godfather, the Reverend B.B. Brophy of Swords." Gardner also mentions Carroll's fondness for anagrams, and you probably noticed that Antrim is an anagram of Martin, but you might not know that the Reverend Dodson's pseudonym before he came up with Lewis Carroll was B.B. October 1964's The Pythagorean Theorem quotes Carroll from his Curiosa Mathematica, Part 1, A New Theory of Parallels. Such a theorem as the square of the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the sides is as dazzlingly beautiful now as it was in the day when Pythagoras first discovered it and celebrated its advent, it is said, by sacrificing a hecatomb, that's 100, of oxen, a method of doing honor to science that has always seemed to me slightly exaggerated and uncalled for. One can imagine oneself, even in these degenerate days, marking the epoch of some brilliant scientific discovery by inviting a convivial friend or two to join one in a beefsteak and a bottle of wine. But a hecatomb of oxen, it would produce a quite inconvenient supply of beef. Gardner's Infinite Regress in 1865 starts with an epigraph of this cartoon, which is not shown, but I dug up from a 1952 issue of Punch. Mr. Chairman, before we put the motion that the motion be now put, should we not first put the motion that the motion be now put? Gardner then begins, the infinite regress along which thought is compelled to march backwards in a never-ending chain of identical steps has always aroused mixed emotions. I'm sure this audience is familiar with Zeno's Achilles paradox. Agrippa, an ancient Greek skeptic who lived 3 centuries after Zeno, argued that nothing can be proved, even in mathematics, because every proof must be proved valid, and its proof must in turn be proved, and so on. Carroll posed the question for modern times in his article, What the Tortoise Said to Achilles, which was published in a British journal called Mind in April of 1895. After finishing their famous race, the tortoise traps his fellow athlete in a more disturbing regress. He refuses to accept a simple deduction involving a triangle until Achilles has written down an infinite series of hypothetical assumptions, each necessary to make the preceding argument valid. By the way, does that diagram look familiar? The proof goes as follows. Things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. B, the two sides of this triangle are things that are equal to the same. Z, the two sides of this triangle are equal to each other. But that implies C. If A and B are true, Z must be true, which implies D, and so on. This is sometimes called Carroll's paradox of inference and is considered as a classic text in the philosophy of logic. As of today, remarkably, there's been no attempted resolution to the problem, accepted resolution. 14 years later, of course, Doug Hofstadter's put Achilles and the tortoise through their paces. I'll talk about that later. In a similar vein, Martin mentions that through the looking glass, Alice dreams of the Red King, but the king is fast asleep. And as Tweedledee points out, Alice is only sort of a thing in his dream. The column in August of 1966, called The Rising Hourglass and Other Physics Puzzles, discusses Carroll's carriage. And Sylvie and Bruno concluded, Mein Herr, once again, explains how people in his country need not go to sea to enjoy the sensations of pitching and rolling. This is accomplished, he says, by putting oval wheels on carriages. And Earl, who is listening, says that he can see how oval wheels could make a carriage pitch backwards and forwards, but how could they make the carriage roll, too? Later in the book, Mein Herr, by the way, introduces a gravitational Gedanken experiment that prefigures Einstein, but that's another story. Hypercubes, November 1966. Here Martin mentions there's the short story Mimsy with the Borogoves, which first appeared in Astounding Science Fiction in February 1943, written by the husband and wife team of Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore under the pseudonym Lewis Paget. In the story, some children find a wire model of a tesseract with colored beads that slide along the wires in curious ways, which teaches the children how to think four-dimensionally. With the aid of some cryptic advice from Carroll's poem Jabberwocky, they finally walk out of three-space altogether. The story was loosely adapted into a film in 2007. I don't know why they changed the spelling, and if you're truly masochistic, William Shatner released an audio version. In January 1967, Wordsmith College, the renowned Dr. Matrix himself, mentions Carroll's fondness for his skill at acrostics and highlights the dedicatory poem of Carroll's A Tangle Tale. This 1885 book, one of the first recreational mathematics texts, is a collection of 10 short humorous stories he calls knots, originally published in the monthly Packet magazine. The introduction reads, "The writer's intention was to embody in each knot, like medicine so dexterously but ineffectually concealed in the jam of our early childhood, one or more mathematical questions in arithmetic, algebra, or geometry, as the case might be, for the amusement and possible edification of the fair readers of that magazine." The dedicatee here was his friend Edith Rix, R-I-X, whom he met through correspondence when she was 19 and became a lifelong friend. She went on to study mathematics at Cambridge and was later hired on staff at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich with a title, Lady Computer. Another small digression, in the 19th century, a person who was good at computation was called a computer, and a person who types was called a typewriter. So, where's the acrostic in the dedicatory poem? Bad at FTE? How about the second letters? Ta-da! May 1967's Trick of Lightning Calculator says that many methods for calculating the day of the week mentally were published in the late 19th century, but I have found none earlier than the method invented by Lewis Carroll and explained by him in Nature, March 31st, 1887. "I am not a rapid computer myself," see? Carroll wrote, and as I find my average time for doing any such question is about 20 seconds, I have little doubt that a rapid computer would not need 15. September 1967's column was concerned with double acrostics, of which Carroll created many splendid specimens. His best was, opines Martin, is one that first appeared in his 1869 book, Phantasmagoria. It's a series of 13 riddles, the solutions to which form a double acrostic. For example, the solution to number 1, "Yet what are all such gaieties to me, whose thoughts are full of indices and surds, x squared plus 7x plus 53 equals 11/3, is quadratic. Carroll said that it was written at the request of some young friends who had gone to a ball at the Oxford Commemoration, which explains that the acrostics spell quasi-insanity and commemoration. Carroll never gave a solution, and this is one example. Other solutions to individual riddles have been proposed. For example, verse 9, "Flushed with new life, the crowd flows back again. And all is tangle talk and mazy motion, much like a waving field of golden grain on a tempestuous ocean." Over the years, answers other than arena have been proposed, including Arcadia, Aurora, Abracadabra. But when I look around me, may I suggest an equally appropriate one, Atlanta. A crowd, a tangled talk, an ocean? Well, as a pun, it works fine, but in truth, Atlanta was named for the fleet-footed huntress of Greek mythology, while the Atlantic for the god Atlas. In his column, The Rotating Round Table and Other Problems of April 1969, Gardner quotes the fifth of Carroll's pillow problems. A bag contains one counter known to be either white or black. A white counter is put in, the bag shaken, and a counter drawn out, which proves to be white. What is now the chance of drawing a white counter? At first sight, Carroll begins his answer, it would appear that as the state of the bag after the operation is necessarily identical with its state before it, the chance is just what it was, videlicet 1 of 2. This, however, is an error. Carroll goes on to show that the probability of a white counter remaining in the bag is actually 2 out of 3. Curiosa Mathematica, Part 2, Pillow Problems, thought out during sleepless nights, to give it its full title, published by Macmillan in 1893, was a record of Carroll's way of dealing with insomnia. He set himself the task of framing and solving the 72 problems without putting a mark on paper until morning, when he would write them up and in a form that looked like this. Geometrical fallacies, April 1971, Gardner says, since Euclid's time, hundreds of amusing examples of geometric fallacies have been published, some of them genuine mistakes, and some deliberately contrived. He shows how the viewer is led down a garden path to the false conclusion he called QED, quite entertainingly deceptive. Two of the ones he featured, namely Theorem 1, every triangle is isosceles, and Theorem 2, an obtuse angle is sometimes equal to a right angle. He quotes from the Lewis Carroll picture book, 1899, because although Carroll did not invent them, he explains them so well. Hello, Martin. In Charles Adams' Skier and Other Problems in 1872, Gardner says that Lewis Carroll likes to tell about a man who had such big feet that he had to put his trousers on over his head. In the column of August 1974, the subject is tangrams. Hope I have the right slide here. Woohoo! One of the earliest English books on tangrams, a copy of which was owned by Lewis Carroll, came into the possession of metrograbologist Henry Dudney after Carroll's death in 1898. It's called A Fashionable Chinese Puzzle and was first published in New York. The date of the edition was not stated, but it is attributed to 1815 because it contains a note about Napoleon and his exile. Tangrams, of course, were the first international puzzle craze. Gardner's February 1975 article on the subject of nothing discusses the null set, holes, zero, the ether, non-being, blank books, metaphysics, and its application to the arts, such as John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, or I've Got Plenty of Nothing, and so on. He recalls this conversation in The Looking Glass. Who did you pass on the road? The king went on, holding out his hand to the messenger for some more hay. Nobody, said the messenger. Quite right, said the king. This young lady saw him too. So of course nobody walks slower than you. I do my best, the messenger said in a sulky tone. I'm sure nobody walks much faster than I do. Well, we can't do that, said the king, or else he'd have been here first. So the article starts and ends with witty quotes from the ever-delightful Peter Heath, who, as it happens, was one time president of our society and wrote a book called The Philosopher's Alice. Since he was selected to write the article on the subject Nothing for the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, his business card proudly proclaimed the world's foremost expert on nothing. In the sixth symbol and other problem, in November 1975, Gardner says that in 1877, Carroll included in a letter to Maud Standen, a child friend, a 6-line poem he called an anagrammatic sonnet. Each line has 4 feet. Carroll wrote to Maud, each foot is an anagram. Here is the sonnet. Gardner remarked that it was not all that interesting in light of the much more creative anagrams Carroll came up with, such as this one for the Prime Minister, William Ewart Gladstone, wild agitator, means well. In Curious Maps of December 1975, Gardner says, a large class of eccentric maps that we have not considered are the maps of imaginary regions. He talks about might-have-been maps, fantasy maps depicting Oz, Hell, Barsoom, Middle-earth, Atlantis, and other fanciful realms. He adds that we must not forget the Bellman's ocean chart in Fit 2 of The Hunting of the Snark. Other maps are such shapes with their islands and capes, but we've got our brave captain to thank, so the crew would protest that he's brought us the best, a perfect and absolute blank. Gardner also mentions a map in chapter 11 of Sylvie and Bruna Concluded, wherein our old friend Mein Herr is speaking to the narrator. That's another thing we have learned from your nation, said Mein Herr, map making, but we've carried it much further than you. What do you consider the largest map that would be really useful? About 6 inches to the mile. Only 6 inches, explained Mein Herr. We very soon got to 6 yards to the mile. Then we tried 100 yards to the mile. And then we came the grandest idea of all. We actually made a map of the country on the scale of a mile to the mile. Have you used it much? I inquired. It's never been spread out yet, said Mein Herr, as the farmers objected. They said it would cover the whole country and shut out the sunlight. So we now use the country itself as its own map, and I assure you it does nearly as well. Martin's column, Trivalent Graphs, Snarks, and Boojums, from April of 1976, talks about the famed 4-color theorem, I don't have to explain to you. Dozens of conjectures, seemingly unrelated to maps, he reports, are equivalent to the four-color map theorem in the sense that if you settle any one of them, you settle the four-color problem. In the search for counterexamples, he uses trivalent graphs, one which three edges meet at each vertex, noting that any map can be transformed into a trivalent map with the same coloring properties. At a later point, he says it would be convenient to have a term for non-trivial, uncolorable, trivalent graphs, and rejects the acronym NUTS, instead proposing the term snarks, as anyone who pursues them with forks and hopes is like the mad snark-hunting crew. Snarks are difficult to find. He posits that there may be an exceedingly rare and dangerous variety he calls a boojum, a trivalent graph that refutes the four-color conjecture by providing a countermap. His column appears in the April 1976 issue. By July of that same year, the headline, "Four Colors Suffice," was circulated around the globe, the conjecture having been solved by Kenneth Appel and Wolfgang Haken with extensive computer assistance. Hence, there are no boojums, but interest in snarks has persisted, as has his name for them. Of course, that's just another example of using Carrollian names for unusual or paradoxical things. Physicists are so fond of them that we Carrollians call it the CNQP thread, that's Carrollian nomenclature in quantum physics. We have noted in scientific publications such things as the Carroll particle, the Alice handle, Alice strings, and even an Alice universe. Would that Martin were here to explain such things to us mortals. In Hyperbolas, in September of 1977, the epigraph quotes Carroll's The Dynamics of a Particle again. What mathematician has ever pondered over a hyperbola, mangling the unfortunate curve with lines of intersection here and there in his efforts to prove some property that perhaps, after all, is mere calumny, who has not fancied at last that the ill-used locus was spreading out its asymptotes as a silent rebuke, or winking one focus at him in contemptuous pity. In Raymond Smullyan's Logic Puzzles of March 1978, Martin discussed the book whose title could only have come from the late, great Ray Smulyan. What is the name of his book? Ray, who needs no introduction to this audience, with his wicked sense of humor, brilliance in so many fields, and delight in logic, puzzles, and paradoxes, was of course a Carroll fan, and populated his puzzles with Alice, the Lion, and the Unicorn, Humpty Dumpty, and so on, even at one point employing a third twin brother, Tweedledoo. 4 years after this article, Ray published Alice in Puzzle Land, with many more Alice-themed logic puzzles, sporting an introduction by Martin Gardner, of course. Gardner's article, Minimal Sculpture, in November of 1978, says, I like this, Lewis Carroll is among those who have felt that an ordinary cube is too minimal to have much aesthetic value, and no one has been funnier in the written criticism of such art. In 1872, a new belfry was designed to house the bells that had been removed from the Cathedral of Christ Church. The belfry, placed over an elegant staircase leading to the hall at a corner of the great quadrangle, was nothing more than a simple wood cube. The design so annoyed Dodson that he privately published a monograph on the subject titled The New Belfry of Christ Church, Oxford. It's a very funny dig at the design addressed to Dean Little, father of the young Alice. There's a photo by Dodson of the Christ Church Tom Quad. On the cover of the book, what looks like a square is captioned, East View of the New Belfry, Christ Church as seen from the meadow. In July of 1979, Martin discusses Douglas Hofstadter's Gödel Escher Bach, another topic far too grand for this talk. Its cover proclaimed it a metaphorical fugue on minds and machines in the spirit of Lewis Carroll. As we all know, the book takes the form of interweaving narratives, wherein the main chapters alternate with dialogues between imaginary characters, usually Carroll's Achilles and the tortoise, for reasons we talked about before, often resulting in what he terms strange loops or tangled hierarchies. The column titled Pie and Poetry, Some Accidental Patterns, in September 1979, mentions Carroll's introduction to his epic poem, Hiawatha's Photographing, which parodies Longfellow's 1855 Song of Hiawatha. Could I ask you to read it to yourself? Did any of you discover its secret? In these days of imitation, I can claim no sort of merit for the slight attempt at doing what is known to be so easy. Anyone who knows what verse is with the slightest ear for rhythm can throw off a composition in the easy running meter of the Song of Hiawatha, and so on. Carroll last appeared in Mathematical Games in a column on non-Euclidean geometry in October 1981. Here Gardner notes, curiously, Lewis Carroll was one of the last mathematicians to doubt non-Euclidean geometry. It's a strange paradox, the geometer H.S.M. Coxeter has written, that he, whose Alice in Wonderland could alter her size by eating a little cake, was unable to accept the possibility that the area of a triangle could remain finite while its sides tend to infinity. This is actually a perfect lead into the next talk where Stan Isaacs will address this very question. So the subject of my talk here was Gardner's affinity for Lewis Carroll as expressed in his Mathematical Games column. I would like to thank very much Dana Richards for suggesting it. Of course, it doesn't end there. Had I but whirled enough in time, I could ramble on about Gardner's many other writings about Carroll, such as The Universe in a Handkerchief, subtitled Mathematical Recreations, Games, Puzzles, and Wordplays, some of which appeared in his column, some not, but that's beyond, again, the present universe of discourse. Maybe next time. So, in conclusion, may I quote from Carroll's poem, Atalanta in Camden Town, published in 1869. Ah, 'twas here on this spot, in that summer of yore, Atalanta did not vote my presence a bore, nor replied to my tenderest talk, she'd heard all that nonsense before. Thank you.